My father burst through my apartment door without knocking, his face flushed with panic and desperation. He slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto my kitchen table papers, scattering across the surface. "Your sister Emma owes $850,000 to some very dangerous people," he declared, his voice shaking with urgency. "They're coming for her tomorrow morning, and you're the only one who can save her life, Kenny. I need the money by tomorrow. You have to help us." I stared at those papers, my world tilting sideways. The weight of those documents felt heavier than their physical presence suggested. As I picked up the first page, memories flooded back like a broken dam, releasing years of stored resentment and pain. Growing up in suburban Denver, Emma had always been the shining star while I remained invisible in the background. She was 3 years younger, blessed with striking features and a charismatic personality that drew people like moths to a flame. Meanwhile, I was the quiet, studious one who earned straight A's, but never received the same praise Emma got for simply existing. After high school, I worked 2 jobs to put myself through Colorado State University's business program. Emma, on the other hand, convinced our parents to fund her gap year in California, where she supposedly discovered her passion for social media and lifestyle content creation. While I studied corporate finance and business strategy late into the night, Emma was posting sunset photos from Malibu beaches and building what she called her personal brand. Following graduation, I started my consulting firm, Turner Solutions, specializing in helping struggling companies reorganize their operations and finances. Those first 2 years were brutal. I worked 16-hour days, lived on ramen noodles and coffee, and reinvested every dollar back into the business. Slowly, word spread about my success rate with troubled corporations. Fortune 500 companies began seeking my expertise for their most challenging turnaround projects. Emma, meanwhile, had transformed herself into what she called a lifestyle influencer and entrepreneur. Her Instagram account showcased designer handbags, expensive restaurant meals, and luxury travel destinations. She promoted various products to her growing follower base, claiming to be building multiple income streams through affiliate marketing and sponsored content. Our parents constantly bragged about Emma's business success and her innovative approach to modern entrepreneurship. The first time my family asked for financial help was 2 years ago. Emma had accumulated $12,000 in credit card debt, buying photography equipment and paying for professional photo shoots. She tearfully explained how investing in her content creation was essential for her career growth, but cash flow was temporarily tight. I wrote the check without hesitation, believing her promises about paying me back once her next sponsorship deals came through. 6 months later, Emma needed rent money for her downtown apartment. Then it was car payments for her leased BMW. Each request came with elaborate explanations about delayed payments from brands, temporary setbacks in her business ventures, or unexpected expenses that had disrupted her carefully planned budget. I covered every debt, every emergency, every crisis, because that's what family does for each other. Last year, my father approached me with medical bills totaling $15,000. He claimed Mom needed specialized treatment for a heart condition and their insurance wouldn't cover the experimental procedures. I immediately transferred the money, only to discover months later that Mom was perfectly healthy. My father had used the money to cover gambling debts from his weekend trips to the casino in Black Hawk. Now, sitting at my kitchen table with $850,000 in debt documents spread before me, I realized the pattern of manipulation had escalated beyond anything I'd previously imagined. My father paced frantically across my small living room, running his hands through his graying hair as he explained Emma's latest crisis. According to his account, Emma had gotten involved with cryptocurrency investments over the past year. She'd been promoting various digital currencies to her followers, claiming insider knowledge about emerging opportunities in the blockchain space. Her social media posts featured screenshots of trading accounts showing massive gains, luxury purchases, funded by her crypto success, and motivational content about financial independence through digital investments. The reality, as my father reluctantly revealed, was far more sinister. Emma had convinced hundreds of her followers to invest their life savings based on her recommendations. She'd promoted herself as a self-made crypto expert who'd turned a small initial investment into millions. People had trusted her, liquidated their retirement accounts borrowed against their homes, and invested their children's college funds based on her promises of guaranteed returns. When the schemes inevitably collapsed, Emma's followers lost everything. But rather than disappearing quietly, several investors had discovered Emma's real identity and location. They weren't just angry about losing money, my father explained with growing agitation. Some of these people had lost their entire life savings, their homes, their futures. They blamed Emma for deliberately misleading them, and they wanted justice. "She's been getting death threats, Kenny," my father said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "These people know where she lives, where she works, where she shops. They're organized and they're serious. Emma's been hiding at different hotels every night, but they keep finding her. She can't live like this anymore." I studied the legal documents, more carefully recognizing the letterhead of a prominent Denver law firm. The paperwork outlined multiple lawsuits filed against Emma for securities fraud, false advertising, and consumer protection violations. The total amount of damages claimed exceeded $850,000, with additional punitive damages and legal fees being sought. Why didn't she just declare bankruptcy? I asked, though I suspected the answer would reveal even more troubling details. My father's face reddened, and he avoided eye contact. "She can't file for bankruptcy, Kenny. There are complications with her business structure. Her lawyers say the way she set up her companies makes her personally liable for everything. Plus, if she files for bankruptcy, the court will investigate how she spent the money, and that could lead to criminal charges." The pieces were starting to connect in my mind. Emma hadn't just made poor investment recommendations to her followers. She'd likely been operating some kind of deliberate fraud scheme, possibly a Ponzi operation where she used new investors' money to pay earlier participants while skimming profits for herself. The luxury lifestyle she'd been showcasing wasn't funded by legitimate business success but by stealing from people who trusted her. "What exactly do you expect me to do?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Pay the debt," my father said without hesitation. $850,000, and this all goes away. The lawsuits get settled, Emma can start fresh, and our family can move on from this nightmare. You're the only one with that kind of money, Kenny. Your business has been incredibly successful. You can afford this." The casual way he discussed such an enormous sum revealed how my family had come to view my financial success. To them, my years of education, sacrifice, and hard work had simply created a resource they could tap whenever needed. They saw my money as their emergency fund available on demand for any crisis they created. "And if I refuse," I asked. My father's expression hardened. "Then Emma goes to prison, and probably worse before that happens. These people she owes money to aren't going to wait for the legal system to play out. They want their money back, and they don't care how they get it. Emma made a mistake, but she's still your sister. Are you really going to let her suffer because you're too selfish to help family?" There it was. The guilt trip, the emotional manipulation, the implication that my financial success somehow obligated me to solve everyone else's problems. I'd heard variations of this speech dozens of times over the years, but never with stakes this high. Looking at my father's desperate expression, I realized he genuinely believed I would simply write a check and make this problem disappear. He had no doubt that family loyalty would override my judgment, that my love for Emma would blind me to the reality of what she'd done. In his mind, this was just another family emergency where Kenny would step in and save the day. I thought about Emma's Instagram posts from the past year, her confident declarations about financial independence and smart investing. I remembered feeling proud of her apparent success, even slightly jealous that she'd found such an easy path to wealth while I'd worked so hard for mine. Now, I understood that her entire public persona had been built on lies and stolen money. "I need to see all the documentation," I said, finally. "Bank statements, investment records, the full scope of what she owes and to whom. If I'm going to help, I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." My father's relief was palpable. "Of course, absolutely. Emma has everything organized. She's been working with lawyers and accountants to get this sorted out. You're making the right choice, Kenny. Family has to stick together, especially during times like this." As he prepared to leave and gathered the additional documents, I found myself wondering how I'd become the designated family ATM. When had my success created an obligation to fund everyone else's failures? And more importantly, how many times was I going to let them exploit my loyalty before I finally said enough? The next morning arrived with my father's promised return, carrying 2 additional briefcases filled with Emma's financial records. As a business consultant who'd spent years analyzing complex corporate financial structures, I immediately began organizing the documents systematically. What I discovered in those first 30 minutes of review sent ice through my veins. My own signature appeared on dozens of loan applications, credit agreements, and business partnership documents that I'd never seen before. According to these papers, I was listed as a co-guarantor for multiple business loans totaling over $400,000. My Social Security number, driver's license information, and even copies of my tax returns were attached to applications for credit lines that I'd never authorized. "Dad," I said, holding up a loan agreement from First National Bank dated 6 months ago. "This has my signature on it, but I've never been to First National Bank in my life. How do you explain this?" His face immediately flushed, and he began fidgeting with his coffee cup. Well, Emma was desperate. She needed someone with good credit to co-sign for some business investments. She knew you'd want to help if you understood the opportunity, so she forged my signature on legal documents. I interrupted, my voice rising. "Dad, this is identity theft. This is fraud. Do you understand what you're telling me?" The defensive posture he adopted told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. Emma had systematically stolen my identity to fund her fraudulent investment schemes, and my father had been aware of it from the beginning. Over the next hour, I used my business contacts to verify the extent of the damage. Phone calls to various banks and financial institutions revealed a pattern of identity theft that had been ongoing for over 8 months. Emma had opened business credit lines using my information, taken out equipment loans for her content creation company, and even secured a mortgage on a commercial property that I'd supposedly purchased for investment purposes. My credit score, which had been excellent due to years of responsible financial management, had been destroyed. Late payments over extended credit lines and defaulted loans now appeared on my credit report. According to the credit agencies, I was financially overextended and represented a significant lending risk. But the most devastating discovery came when I traced the paper trail of how Emma had obtained my personal information. Text messages on my father's unlocked phone revealed months of planning and coordination. Emma had asked him to photograph documents from my desk during family dinners at my house. She'd requested copies of my tax returns, which he'd provided from files I'd given him for estate planning purposes. Most disturbing, they'd discussed the best approaches for manipulating me into accepting responsibility for debts I'd never incurred. One text exchange from 3 months ago made my stomach turn. "Emma, the Denver Community Bank loan got approved with Kenny's info. Told them he's traveling, and I'm handling paperwork as his business partner. Dad, good. How much did you get? Emma, $75,000. Plenty to cover the next round of investments and keep the followers happy with some big wins. Dad, what happens when Kenny finds out? Emma, by then, we'll have made enough profit to pay everything back plus extra. He'll be proud of how smart we were. Reading those messages, I realized my family hadn't just betrayed my trust. They'd gambled with my entire financial future based on the assumption that their schemes would somehow work out. They'd never considered the possibility that I might be held legally responsible for debts they'd created in my name. Further investigation revealed that Emma's cryptocurrency fraud operation was even more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. She hadn't just been promoting bad investments to her followers. She'd been operating what law enforcement would later classify as a classic Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay fake returns to earlier participants while siphoning profits for her personal use. The luxury lifestyle she'd been showcasing on social media, the designer clothes, expensive restaurants, high-end apartment, and international travel, had all been funded by money stolen from people who trusted her investment advice. She'd created fake trading accounts showing massive gains, doctored screenshots of profitable transactions, and fabricated testimonials from supposedly successful investors. But Emma had made a critical error that would ultimately expose her entire operation. She'd gotten greedy and started promising returns that were mathematically impossible to sustain. When new investor money couldn't keep pace with the promised payouts, the scheme began collapsing. Rather than admitting her fraud and facing the consequences, she'd doubled down by using my identity to secure additional funding to keep the operation running. The commercial property mortgage I'd supposedly signed for turned out to be Emma's attempt to create a legitimate business front for her operations. She'd established a company called Digital Asset Strategies, with me listed as the primary investor and managing partner. This gave her operation an air of legitimacy when promoting investment opportunities to potential victims. My father's role in the scheme extended beyond just providing access to my personal information. Bank records showed he'd been receiving monthly payments from Emma's company, officially listed as consulting fees, but actually his cut of the stolen money. For the past year, he'd been supplementing his retirement income with proceeds from his daughter's fraud operation. The most chilling discovery came when I found recordings on Emma's phone that my father had accidentally left behind. In these audio files, Emma and her business partner, a man named Brad Peterson, discussed their long-term strategy for the operation. They'd identified me as their exit strategy, someone with enough legitimate wealth and business success to cover their debts if the scheme collapsed. In one recording, Emma laughed while explaining her insurance policy. "Even if everything falls apart, Kenny will bail us out. He always does. The guy can't say no to family, especially if we make him feel guilty enough. Plus, once his name is on all these documents, he'll have to pay anyway, or his own reputation gets destroyed." Brad's response was even more disturbing. "And if he refuses to cooperate, we've got enough evidence of his involvement to make it look like he was part of the operation from the beginning. His signature is on everything now. Who's going to believe he didn't know what was happening?" Sitting in my home office, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate betrayal I could have imagined, I realized my family hadn't just asked me to pay Emma's debt. They'd systematically destroyed my financial reputation, stolen my identity, and created a situation where I would be held legally responsible for crimes I'd never committed. They'd planned to use my love and loyalty against me, confident that I would sacrifice my own future to protect them from the consequences of their actions. The $850,000 they wanted wasn't just payment for Emma's debt. It was ransom for my own financial life held hostage by people I'd trusted completely. They'd bet everything on their ability to manipulate me one more time, never considering that I might discover the full scope of their deception. As afternoon sunlight streamed through my office windows, I began planning my response. This wasn't going to be another family emergency where Kenny quietly wrote a check and pretended nothing had happened. Emma and my father had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, violated trust that couldn't be restored, and committed crimes that couldn't be ignored. For the first time in years, I wasn't going to be the family's solution to a crisis they'd created. I was going to become their biggest problem. The business card in my wallet belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a private investigator I'd hired 2 years ago to conduct due diligence on a potential merger client. Her expertise in financial fraud investigation had been instrumental in uncovering accounting irregularities that saved my firm millions of dollars. Now, I needed those same skills turned toward my own family's criminal activities. Sarah's office occupied the top floor of a downtown Denver high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Rocky Mountains. Her reputation for discretion and thoroughness had made her the preferred investigator for several major corporations dealing with internal fraud cases. When I called her that afternoon, she agreed to an emergency meeting despite her packed schedule. "Kenny, I have to ask," she said after reviewing the documents I'd brought. "Are you prepared for what we might find? Family investigations often uncover information that's more devastating than financial fraud. Sometimes ignorance really is bliss. I need to know everything," I replied. "If I'm going to protect myself legally and financially, I can't have any surprises." What Sarah uncovered over the next 72 hours shattered any remaining illusions I had about my family's character. Using her network of contacts in banking, law enforcement, and digital forensics, she reconstructed the full timeline and scope of Emma's criminal enterprise. The cryptocurrency fraud operation had been running for 14 months, not the 6 months my father had claimed. Emma's first victims were her own college friends and former co-workers, people who knew her personally and trusted her recommendations because of their relationship. She'd convinced her former roommate Jessica to invest her grandmother's inheritance, promising guaranteed returns that would fund Jessica's medical school tuition. When Jessica lost everything, Emma had consoled her by claiming that market volatility was temporary and that bigger profits were coming soon. She'd convinced Jessica to take out student loans for additional investments, promising that the returns would cover both the original losses and the new loan payments. Jessica was now facing bankruptcy at age 24, her medical school dreams destroyed by debt she couldn't possibly repay. The pattern repeated with dozens of other victims. Emma's high school friend Monica had invested her parents' entire retirement savings based on Emma's promises. A former co-worker named Derek had mortgaged his house to participate in what Emma called exclusive investment opportunities available only to her inner circle. Each victim received the same treatment: initial small returns to build confidence, followed by requests for larger investments, ending with total losses and elaborate explanations about temporary market conditions. But Sarah's investigation revealed something even more sinister than a standard Ponzi scheme. Emma hadn't been losing her victims' money through bad investments. She'd been deliberately moving their funds to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland, building a personal fortune while her victims faced financial ruin. Bank records obtained through Sarah's law enforcement contacts showed a complex network of shell companies and international transfers designed to hide stolen assets. Emma had established accounts under false names in 3 different countries, accumulating over $2 million in stolen funds while maintaining the pretense of being a failed entrepreneur who'd lost money alongside her investors. The most devastating discovery involved my father's deeper participation in the scheme. He hadn't just provided access to my personal information and received monthly payments. He'd been actively recruiting victims through his social networks, targeting his friends' adult children, and presenting Emma's investment opportunities as family-approved business ventures. Sarah found audio recordings of my father calling his golf buddies, church members, and former co-workers, explaining how his brilliant daughter had discovered incredible investment opportunities in the cryptocurrency space. He'd used his relationships and reputation to provide Emma with credibility when approaching potential victims who might otherwise have been skeptical of investment advice from a young social media influencer. "Your sister and father have defrauded at least 300 people," Sarah explained during our follow-up meeting. "The total amount stolen exceeds $4 million, not the $850,000 they're claiming. They're only acknowledging the debts they can't hide, hoping you'll pay those while they keep the rest of their stolen assets protected. The offshore accounts were just part of their asset protection strategy." Emma had been purchasing luxury goods, fine art, and jewelry that could be easily liquidated or hidden if law enforcement began investigating. She'd bought a vacation home in Costa Rica under a false identity and established business relationships with money laundering operations that specialized in helping cryptocurrency fraudsters hide stolen funds. But the most shocking revelation involved their exit strategy for dealing with my potential resistance to their demands. Sarah had obtained text messages between Emma and an associate named Marcus Chen, who specialized in identity manipulation and documentation fraud. They'd been discussing how to frame me as the mastermind behind the investment scheme if I refused to pay their debts. The plan was sophisticated and terrifying in its scope. Emma had been building a false narrative that portrayed me as her silent business partner, who'd provided the initial capital and strategic guidance for her cryptocurrency investments. She'd created fake emails for me, discussing investment strategies, forged documents showing my involvement in her company's formation, and even staged photographs of us together at business meetings that had never occurred. If I'd refused to pay their debts, Emma planned to claim that I'd been the real architect of the fraud scheme, using her social media presence as a front for my illegal activities. She'd argue that I'd manipulated her into promoting investments while hiding my identity to avoid regulatory oversight. The forged documents would support her claims, making it appear that I'd been involved from the beginning. Marcus Chen's role was to provide false witnesses who would testify about my supposed involvement in planning meetings and strategy sessions. He'd recruited several people who would swear under oath that they'd seen me directing Emma's activities and receiving profits from the fraud operation. In exchange for their false testimony, these witnesses were being paid from the stolen cryptocurrency funds. "They've essentially created a blackmail operation," Sarah explained. "Either you pay their debts and accept responsibility for crimes you didn't commit, or they destroy your reputation and frame you as a criminal mastermind. They've covered all the angles to ensure you can't refuse their demands." The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Emma and my father had spent months planning not just the fraud itself, but also the manipulation strategy they'd use to force my compliance when their scheme inevitably collapsed. They'd weaponized my love for family against me, confident that my desire to protect Emma would blind me to their true intentions. But Sarah had uncovered one critical weakness in their plan. In their arrogance and greed, Emma and her associates had left digital fingerprints throughout their operations. Every email, text message, financial transfer, and planning session had been documented in ways that could be traced and verified. Their attempts to frame me would crumble under scrutiny because the evidence clearly showed the timeline of their deception. "You have everything you need to not only protect yourself, but also ensure they face appropriate consequences," Sarah said. "But Kenny, you need to understand that this will destroy your family relationships permanently. There's no coming back from this level of betrayal once you expose it." Looking out at the Denver skyline from Sarah's office, I realized my family relationships had already been destroyed the moment Emma forged my signature on that first loan document. The people who'd raised me, who I'd loved and supported for years, had never actually existed. They'd been replaced by criminals who saw me only as a resource to be exploited and then discarded when convenient. The choice before me wasn't between family loyalty and self-protection. It was between justice and allowing dangerous criminals to continue victimizing innocent people while using my identity as their shield. Emma and my father had made their choice when they decided to build their criminal empire on the foundation of my stolen identity and reputation. Now it was time for me to make mine. The revelation that my family had already told their criminal associates about my guaranteed payment created an immediate physical threat that required sophisticated planning. Sarah's contacts in law enforcement had identified Emma's business partners as members of an organized fraud network that used intimidation and violence to collect debts and silence potential witnesses. These weren't desperate victims seeking justice, but professional criminals who'd been promised $850,000 in exchange for their patience. Detective Robert Hayes of the Denver Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit agreed to meet with me that evening at an unmarked location in suburban Lakewood. His 20-year career investigating white-collar crime had given him extensive experience with cryptocurrency fraud and organized criminal networks that exploited digital currencies for money laundering and international asset transfers. Your sister's operation connects to a larger network we've been investigating for 2 years, Detective Hayes explained. The people she's working with have used violence against uncooperative debtors in the past. Last year, they hospitalized a software engineer in Phoenix who tried to expose their operations. 6 months ago, they burned down a house in Sacramento belonging to someone who threatened to report them to federal authorities. The scope of the threat became clear as Detective Hayes outlined the criminal network's structure. Emma wasn't an independent operator who'd gotten in over her head. She'd been recruited by an established organization that specialized in cryptocurrency fraud, using social media influencers as front operators while providing the technical infrastructure and money laundering capabilities needed for large-scale theft. The smart move is protective custody while we build the federal case, Detective Hayes continued. These people expect payment tomorrow, and when they don't receive it, they'll assume you're planning to expose their operations. That makes you a direct threat to a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Working through the night with Detective Hayes and FBI Special Agent Linda Rodriguez, I developed a comprehensive plan that would protect my safety while gathering evidence needed to prosecute the entire criminal network. The plan required meticulous preparation and split-second timing, but it offered the best chance of ensuring justice for Emma's victims while keeping me alive long enough to testify. The first step involved liquidating assets that Emma and her associates knew about, while secretly protecting my core wealth through channels they couldn't access. I contacted my business partners at Turner Solutions, explaining that a family emergency required me to temporarily step back from operations while maintaining complete confidentiality about the situation. They agreed to manage the firm using our established emergency protocols, allowing business continuity without exposing them to potential threats. My financial advisor, Patricia Goldman, helped me restructure my assets through a complex series of trust arrangements and offshore vehicles designed to protect my legitimate wealth from both criminal seizure and potential civil litigation. The goal was to make it appear that I had limited accessible funds while actually securing my financial future, regardless of how the criminal case developed. If someone comes looking for your money, they'll find enough to believe you're cooperating, not enough to make you a permanent target, Patricia explained as we finalized the transfers. The bulk of your wealth will be protected through structures that can't be traced back to your current identity. Meanwhile, Sarah was coordinating with federal investigators to document every aspect of Emma's criminal operation. Her team had obtained surveillance footage from hotels where Emma had been hiding recorded phone conversations with her criminal associates and traced financial transactions that revealed the full scope of the money laundering network. Each piece of evidence strengthened the federal case while providing additional protection for my eventual testimony. The house preparation required the most careful attention to detail. I needed to create a scene that would communicate my message clearly while providing law enforcement with evidence of my father's reaction to discovering my disappearance. Every room was equipped with hidden cameras and audio recording devices that would capture his response when he realized his manipulation had failed. I removed all valuable items from the house, including family photographs, important documents, and anything with sentimental value. The goal was to create the impression that I'd left permanently, while ensuring that nothing important would be damaged or stolen during the confrontation that was certain to follow. The box I left on the kitchen table required the most strategic thinking. Its contents needed to communicate multiple messages simultaneously that I knew everything about their criminal operations, that I'd already contacted law enforcement, that their threats and manipulation had failed, and that they now faced consequences for their choices rather than benefits from my compliance. Inside the box, I placed printed screenshots of every incriminating text message between Emma and my father, copies of FBI paperwork showing my formal complaint about the identity theft and fraud newspaper articles about similar cryptocurrency fraud prosecutions with sentences highlighted, and a detailed letter explaining my knowledge of their criminal activities and my decision to seek justice rather than enable their crimes. The centerpiece was a USB drive labeled "For Emma's Followers" that contained video evidence of Emma's confession about the fraud scheme, audio recordings of her discussions about framing me for her crimes, and financial documentation showing how she'd stolen from her victims while building personal wealth through offshore accounts. The drive was programmed to automatically upload this evidence to Emma's social media accounts when accessed, ensuring that her victims would learn the truth about her deception. My disappearance letter explained the situation in terms my father would understand. "You raised me to believe that family means protecting each other and standing together during difficult times. Emma chose to steal my identity, destroy my credit, and put my life in danger to fund her criminal activities. You chose to help her plan this deception and profit from her crimes. These choices have consequences that no amount of guilt, manipulation, or family loyalty can overcome. I'm not hiding from you. I'm working with federal investigators to ensure that Emma's victims receive justice and that dangerous criminals face appropriate punishment for their actions." The letter concluded with an ultimatum. You have 24 hours to contact the FBI and offer full cooperation in their investigation. If you choose to protect Emma's criminal operations instead of helping her victims, you'll face the complete legal consequences of your actions. This is your only opportunity to demonstrate that some part of the father who raised me still exists. As I prepared to leave my house for what might be the last time, I felt a profound sadness that had nothing to do with fear or anger. The building that had been my home for 5 years represented the life I'd worked so hard to create after years of education and sacrifice. Emma and my father's criminal activities had contaminated everything I'd built, forcing me to abandon my normal life to seek protection from dangers I'd never imagined. But underneath the sadness was a growing sense of purpose and determination. For years, I'd enabled my family's destructive behavior by providing financial solutions to problems they'd created through poor choices and dishonesty. My willingness to help had actually made their criminal activities possible by removing the natural consequences that might have prevented them from harming so many people. Emma's victims deserved better than my continued silence and compliance. The families who'd lost their life savings, the young people whose futures had been destroyed, the elderly victims who'd been manipulated into investing their retirement funds. They all deserved justice more than Emma deserved protection from the consequences of her choices. As I drove away from my house toward the safe location Detective Hayes had arranged, I watched my father's car pulling into my driveway through the rearview mirror. In a few minutes, he would discover that his manipulation had failed completely, and that his criminal activities would soon be exposed to law enforcement and the general public. The real confrontation was just beginning. From my position in the surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, I watched through live video feeds as my father approached my front door, carrying the briefcase he'd promised to bring for the money transfer. Detective Hayes and FBI Special Agent Rodriguez, monitored multiple camera angles while recording equipment, captured every word and action for use in the federal prosecution. My father's confidence was immediately visible in his body language. He walked with the assured stride of someone who'd successfully manipulated their target and expected to collect the promised reward. His face showed relief rather than concern, confirming that he'd never doubted his ability to guilt me into paying Emma's debts, regardless of the criminal methods they'd used to create those obligations. He really believes you're going to hand over $850,000 to protect a sister who's been stealing your identity, Agent Rodriguez observed. That level of confidence suggests this manipulation tactic has worked multiple times before. The key turned easily in my front door lock, revealing that my father had kept the spare key I'd given him for emergencies. In his mind, this probably qualified as a family emergency that justified entering my house without permission. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was committing another crime in the process of collecting payment for Emma's previous crimes. Security cameras throughout the house tracked his movement as he called out my name, expecting me to respond from another room. When silence greeted his calls, confusion replaced confidence in his facial expression. He began searching room by room, looking for me or evidence of where I might have gone to retrieve the money he expected. The living room search became increasingly frantic, as my father realized the house was essentially empty. Missing furniture, bare walls, and empty shelves suggested a permanent departure rather than a temporary absence. His phone calls to my cell number went directly to voicemail, adding to his growing anxiety about the situation he was discovering. Kitchen cameras captured the moment he noticed the box sitting alone on the table, where we'd reviewed Emma's debt documents the previous day. For several minutes, he stared at it without moving, as if sensing that its contents would fundamentally change his understanding of the situation he thought he'd controlled. When he finally opened the box, his reaction exceeded even my expectations for shock and horror. The printed screenshots of his text messages with Emma about manipulating me were on top, making his own words the first thing he saw. Reading his casual discussions about my predictability and their strategies for emotional manipulation clearly devastated him in ways I hadn't anticipated. He's realizing that we have documented evidence of every aspect of their criminal conspiracy, Detective Hayes explained, as we watched my father's face turn pale. Those text messages are enough to prosecute him for conspiracy fraud and racketeering under federal law. The FBI paperwork had an even stronger effect. Seeing official federal law enforcement documents with case numbers and agent signatures made him understand that this wasn't a family dispute that could be resolved through guilt trips and emotional manipulation. The federal government was now investigating criminal activities that carried decades of prison time for everyone involved. But the newspaper articles about cryptocurrency fraud prosecutions appeared to terrify him most. The highlighted sentences showed prison terms of 15 to 20 years for similar crimes, asset forfeiture that left defendants financially destroyed, and the lifetime bans from financial services industries. He began to comprehend that cooperation wouldn't just result in family embarrassment, but in the complete destruction of his life as he'd known it. My letter triggered the screaming that we could hear even from 3 blocks away. Reading my detailed knowledge of their criminal activities, my decision to work with law enforcement rather than enable their crimes, and my ultimatum for his cooperation caused a complete emotional breakdown that lasted nearly 10 minutes. "That's not anger," Agent Rodriguez noted. "That's panic. He's realizing that instead of manipulating you into solving their problems, they've created a situation where you have the power to destroy both of them." The USB drive represented the final psychological blow. My father understood Emma's social media presence better than most people his age, having helped her build her following by promoting her content to his social networks. He knew that releasing evidence of her fraud to her 100,000 followers would destroy her career, her reputation, and her ability to continue operating cryptocurrency scams in the future. But more importantly, he realized that Emma's followers included many of her victims, who still didn't know they'd been deliberately defrauded, rather than caught in legitimate investment losses. The USB drive would reveal Emma's confession about stealing their money, her plans to frame me for her crimes, and her complete lack of remorse for destroying their financial futures. Phone cameras captured my father's call to Emma, though the audio was partially obscured by his continued emotional breakdown. From what we could discern, he was trying to warn her about the evidence I'd gathered, while also demanding to know why she hadn't told him about the full scope of her criminal activities. She's probably realizing for the first time that he doesn't know about the offshore accounts and hidden assets, Detective Hayes observed. She's been lying to him about the scope of her crimes, just like she lied to everyone else. The conversation appeared to become heated, as Emma presumably tried to maintain her deception, while my father demanded answers about charges they were likely to face. Through the surveillance equipment, we could hear fragments of his side of the conversation. Phrases like federal investigation, 20-year sentences, and Kenny knows everything revealed the core of their discussion. When the call ended, my father sat in stunned silence for nearly 15 minutes, staring at the evidence spread across my kitchen table. The confident manipulator who'd entered my house expecting to collect payment for his daughter's crimes had been replaced by a broken man facing the complete destruction of his family and his future. This is when reality sets in, Agent Rodriguez explained. He's probably running through every conversation, every text message, every financial transaction, trying to figure out how much evidence we have and whether there's any way to minimize his exposure. The security system tracked my father's movement as he gathered all the evidence from the box, presumably to show Emma the full scope of what I knew about their operations. His departure from my house marked the beginning of what would likely be frantic attempts to hide assets, destroy evidence, and develop strategies for avoiding prosecution. But they were already too late. Federal investigators had been building the case for 3 days while they remained unaware that their crimes had been exposed. Every phone call they made, every financial transaction they attempted, every movement they made was being monitored and documented as additional evidence for the prosecution. As my father's car disappeared down the street, I felt a complex mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness for the family relationships that had been destroyed by criminal betrayal, but satisfaction that Emma's victims would finally receive the justice they deserved. My father's screaming had marked the end of their criminal operations and the beginning of accountability for years of fraud and manipulation. The real confrontation was about to begin. The surveillance van had become my temporary command center for orchestrating the final phase of an operation that would expose years of criminal activity while protecting hundreds of victims from further harm. FBI agents, Denver police detectives, and federal prosecutors worked together to coordinate simultaneous actions across multiple jurisdictions as Emma's criminal network began to unravel. At exactly 6 o'clock that evening, the USB drive I'd left for my father activated its automated upload sequence. Emma's social media accounts, which had built her reputation as a successful cryptocurrency expert, began posting the evidence of her fraud that would destroy that carefully constructed image forever. Her 100,000 followers watched in real time as videos, audio recordings, and financial documents revealed the truth about her criminal activities. The social media response is unprecedented, FBI Agent Rodriguez reported, as she monitored the online activity. Her followers are sharing the evidence faster than we can track. The hashtag EmmaFraud is trending nationally. This couldn't have been more effective if we'd planned it ourselves. The victims' families, many of whom had been following Emma's social media for months, hoping to understand what happened to their money, finally received the answers they'd been seeking. The uploaded evidence showed Emma laughing about their losses, discussing strategies for manipulating additional investments, and planning to disappear with their money once the scheme collapsed. But the social media exposure was just the beginning of my coordinated response to years of family manipulation and criminal exploitation. While Emma and my father scrambled to address their social media crisis, federal investigators executed search warrants at locations across 3 states, seizing computers, financial records, and physical evidence that would support prosecutions for the entire criminal network. The offshore bank accounts Emma thought she'd hidden were simultaneously frozen by international law enforcement cooperation that FBI financial crimes specialists had been developing for months. Swiss and Cayman Islands authorities seized over $2 million in stolen cryptocurrency funds, ensuring that Emma's victims would recover most of their losses through federal asset forfeiture proceedings. My phone call to my father came as federal agents were searching Emma's apartment and discovering evidence of additional crimes that extended far beyond cryptocurrency fraud. The conversation would be recorded and transcribed as part of the federal case, but I wanted him to understand the full scope of what was happening and why his manipulation tactics had failed so completely. "Kenny, you have to stop this," my father pleaded when he answered the phone. "Emma made mistakes, but she's still your sister. This investigation will destroy our entire family. There has to be another way to resolve this situation. Dad, Emma didn't make mistakes," I replied, keeping my voice steady and controlled. She operated a criminal enterprise that stole over $4 million from hundreds of people. She destroyed families, ruined retirements, and ended young people's dreams of college and home ownership. She used my stolen identity to fund her crimes and planned to frame me as the mastermind if I refused to pay her debts. The silence on his end of the call told me he was beginning to understand the difference between family loyalty and criminal complicity. For years, he'd enabled Emma's destructive behavior by treating her crimes as family problems that required Kenny's financial solutions. Now, he was discovering that some actions have consequences that family loyalty cannot overcome. "You could have just paid the money and moved on," he said finally. "Your business is successful enough to absorb $850,000. Why did you have to involve the FBI and destroy Emma's life?" His question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had led to this confrontation. In my father's mind, my financial success created an obligation to solve family problems regardless of their criminal nature. He genuinely believed that my love for Emma should outweigh my concern for her victims or my own legal jeopardy. "Because this isn't about $850,000, I explained. "It's about $4 million stolen from 300 families who trusted Emma with their life savings. It's about young people who can't afford college because Emma convinced their parents to invest their education funds in fraudulent schemes. It's about elderly victims who lost their retirement money because you recruited them through your church and social networks." The emotional weight of his crimes appeared to hit him for the first time, as I described the human cost of Emma's operations and his role in facilitating them. Detective Hayes, who was monitoring our conversation, noted that my father's breathing became labored, and his responses became increasingly disjointed as he processed the scope of damage his family had caused. "Emma told me the investments were legitimate," he protested weakly. "She said she was helping people build wealth through cryptocurrency opportunities. I didn't know she was stealing from them. Dad, you received monthly payments from Emma's company for over a year. You helped her forge my signature on loan documents. You planned strategies for manipulating me into paying debts I never authorized. The text messages prove you knew this was criminal from the beginning." Agent Rodriguez indicated that federal prosecutors were particularly interested in my father's defense attempts because they revealed his consciousness of guilt and his understanding of the criminal nature of his actions. His protests about not knowing the truth contradicted digital evidence that clearly showed his active participation in planning fraudulent activities. "I can cooperate with the investigation," he offered desperately. "I can testify against Emma's associates and help recover more stolen money. There has to be a way to reduce my sentence and keep our family together," His willingness to betray Emma's criminal partners while still trying to protect her revealed the selective moral reasoning that had enabled years of criminal behavior. He could understand the wrongness of their actions when it benefited him to cooperate, but he couldn't accept responsibility for choices that had caused tremendous harm to innocent people. "Your cooperation is between you and the federal prosecutors," I replied. "But Dad, you need to understand that our family relationships ended the moment you decided to help Emma steal my identity and plan criminal activities. The people who raised me, who I loved and supported for years, wouldn't have done these things to me or to Emma's victims." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes as my father cycled through various emotional manipulation tactics that had been successful in previous family conflicts. He tried guilt about destroying family relationships, fear about what would happen to Emma in federal prison, and anger about my selfishness in choosing strangers over family loyalty. But those tactics had lost their power when I discovered the true extent of their criminal planning and manipulation. Understanding that they'd viewed me as nothing more than a financial resource to be exploited had freed me from the emotional bonds that had made their manipulation possible for so many years. The call ended when federal agents arrived at my father's location to execute their search warrant. His final words were a promise to make me regret my decision to involve law enforcement, followed by attempts to hide evidence that agents could see him destroying in real time through surveillance equipment. As evening settled over Denver, I realized that the confrontation I'd been planning for days was essentially complete. Emma's criminal network was being dismantled by federal investigators. Her victims were learning the truth about her fraud through social media exposure, and stolen assets were being recovered for distribution to the people she'd harmed. But more importantly, I'd finally broken free from years of emotional manipulation and criminal exploitation that had disguised itself as family loyalty. For the first time since beginning my business career, my success belonged entirely to me, rather than serving as an emergency fund for family members who viewed my achievements as their personal resources. The real victory wasn't exposing my family's crimes or protecting myself from their consequences. It was discovering that standing up for what's right, even when it requires tremendous personal sacrifice, leads to genuine peace and self-respect that no amount of family approval could provide. 18 months after my father's desperate phone call, I stood in the Denver federal courthouse, watching Emma receive her sentence of 12 years in federal prison for operating a cryptocurrency fraud scheme that had defrauded over 400 families of their life savings. The judge's words about the callous disregard for victims' welfare and sophisticated planning to maximize criminal profits validated everything I'd endured to ensure this moment of justice. My father had received 6 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy identity theft and money laundering charges. His cooperation with federal investigators had helped prosecute other members of Emma's criminal network, but it couldn't undo the damage he'd helped cause to hundreds of innocent people who trusted his recommendations about Emma's investment opportunities. The broader criminal network that had facilitated Emma's operations faced even harsher consequences. Marcus Chen, the identity manipulation specialist, received 22 years for his role in multiple fraud schemes. Brad Peterson, Emma's primary business partner, was sentenced to 18 years and ordered to forfeit over $3 million in stolen assets. The entire organization that had seemed so powerful and dangerous just months earlier had been completely dismantled by federal law enforcement. But the most satisfying outcome involved the recovery of stolen funds for Emma's victims. Federal asset forfeiture proceedings had recovered nearly 90% of the money she'd stolen, including funds hidden in offshore accounts that she'd believed were beyond law enforcement's reach. Families who'd lost their retirement savings were receiving substantial restitution payments that would help rebuild their financial security. Jessica, Emma's former roommate, whose medical school dreams had been destroyed by fraudulent investment losses, sent me a letter describing how the restitution payment had allowed her to return to school and complete her medical degree. Derek, the former co-worker who'd mortgaged his house based on Emma's promises, was able to save his home and even start a small business with his recovered funds. The personal transformation that resulted from confronting my family's criminal activities proved even more meaningful than the legal victories. Turner Solutions. My consulting firm had not only survived the crisis, but had grown substantially as corporate clients sought our expertise specifically because of the integrity I demonstrated during the investigation. Several Fortune 500 companies had hired us exclusively because they wanted to work with someone who'd chosen justice over personal convenience. The foundation I'd established to help fraud victims had assisted over 200 families in recovering stolen assets and rebuilding their financial lives. Working with law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy groups, we'd developed resources and support systems that helped people navigate the complex process of financial recovery, while dealing with the emotional trauma of being deliberately betrayed by trusted individuals. My own healing process had required extensive therapy to address years of emotional manipulation and family dysfunction that I'd never fully recognized until Emma's criminal activities forced me to examine our relationship patterns. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a specialist in family trauma and emotional abuse, helped me understand how my success had made me a target for exploitation by people who saw my achievements as resources for their personal use. Your willingness to sacrifice yourself for family peace enabled their criminal behavior, Dr. Warren explained during one of our sessions. By removing natural consequences for their poor choices, you actually made it easier for them to harm other people. Learning to set healthy boundaries isn't selfish. It's protecting both yourself and society from dangerous individuals who view other people as tools for their personal benefit. The therapy process revealed that my lifelong role as a family problem solver had prevented Emma and my father from developing normal moral reasoning and personal accountability. My willingness to pay for their mistakes had taught them that consequences could always be avoided through emotional manipulation and guilt trips, which ultimately led to the criminal mindset that made their fraud scheme possible. Building healthy relationships with people who valued my character rather than my financial resources required learning entirely new social skills and emotional boundaries. My girlfriend Rachel, whom I'd met through volunteer work at the Fraud Victims Foundation, appreciated my integrity and dedication to helping others recover from financial crimes. Our relationship was built on mutual respect and shared values rather than financial dependence or emotional manipulation. The chosen family I developed through close friendships and professional relationships provided the genuine love and support that I'd always hoped to find in my biological family. Business partners, fellow fraud recovery advocates, and friends who'd supported me during the investigation offered relationships based on genuine caring rather than calculated exploitation. Emma's letters from federal prison revealed that she remained fundamentally unchanged by her criminal prosecution and incarceration. Her correspondence blamed me for ruining her life by refusing to enable her crimes and expressed no remorse for the families she'd destroyed through her fraudulent activities. She continued to view herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control, rather than the architect of a criminal enterprise that had caused tremendous harm. My father's prison letters showed more awareness of the damage his choices had caused, but they also revealed his continued hope that family relationships could be restored once his sentence was completed. While I'd agreed to limited correspondence, I'd made clear that any future relationship would require demonstrated change in behavior, rather than just expressions of regret. The deeper life lesson that emerged from this experience involved understanding the difference between genuine love and manipulative exploitation disguised as family loyalty. True family relationships are built on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared values, rather than financial obligation and emotional manipulation. People who truly care about you don't destroy your reputation, steal your identity, or put your life in danger to solve problems they've created through criminal activities. Standing up for justice, even when it requires confronting people you love, ultimately leads to genuine peace and self-respect that no amount of family approval can provide. The temporary pain of setting healthy boundaries creates space for authentic relationships with people who appreciate your character, rather than viewing you as a resource to be exploited. The most profound realization involved understanding that protecting myself from criminal exploitation wasn't selfish, but necessary for preventing additional harm to innocent victims. By refusing to enable Emma's crimes, I'd helped save other families from financial destruction, while ensuring that dangerous criminals faced appropriate consequences for their actions. My success in business had never been intended to serve as an insurance policy for family members who chose criminal activities over honest work. Learning to protect my achievements from exploitation allowed me to use my resources for genuinely helpful purposes, supporting fraud victims, building ethical business relationships, and creating positive change in my community. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond individual victim assistance to include educational programs that help people recognize and avoid cryptocurrency fraud schemes. Working with law enforcement agencies, we developed resources that had prevented millions of dollars in additional losses by teaching potential victims to identify sophisticated manipulation tactics used by financial criminals. As I reflected on the journey from family exploitation to personal freedom and social justice, I realized that the most important lesson involved learning to distinguish between genuine love and manipulative control. People who truly care about your welfare don't ask you to sacrifice your integrity, destroy your reputation, or enable criminal activities that harm innocent families. The path forward involved using my experience to help other people recognize and escape similar manipulation while building relationships based on authentic caring rather than calculated exploitation. The peace and satisfaction that came from choosing justice over convenience had taught me that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, creates lasting happiness that no amount of family approval could ever provide. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where family loyalty conflicted with doing what's right? How did you navigate the choice between protecting someone you love and standing up for your principles? Your experiences could help other people facing similar dilemmas, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story and supporting the journey toward justice and healing. If this resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories about overcoming betrayal and finding strength, and share this with someone who might benefit from understanding that choosing integrity over convenience always leads to genuine peace. I wish you all the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, and the wisdom to recognize the difference between authentic love and manipulative exploitation.